My talk is about data, and I apologise in advance. I know you've seen a lot of really good creative presentations. I will show some other projects as well, but for me, data is something that's incredibly important. I think, particularly over the last 10 years or so, I've kind of been inspired to sort of seek out data that hopefully supports the role of branding in commercial success, because it's a question I get asked all the time by board members, CEOs, even marketers about, if I'm going to invest all this money, how do I know I'm going to get my money back and multiple times over? And it is a very difficult question because it's very hard to attribute what branding does for this stuff. And I've had a lot of naysayers, and I thought, okay, well, I'll go on my own journey to find some data that actually can prove this. So if people say, hey, I'm not so sure about that, I can say, well, let's have a look at this stuff. In that journey, however, I also found that a lot of people are ignoring that data. And so I thought it was interesting to be able to present the data today. And I actually find it was really heartening to see data in how it was actually showing up some really interesting stuff. So I'm hoping that you will find what I have to say and to go through today quite interesting. So I guess fundamentally, my argument is that if it's hard enough actually making branding a legitimate investment for companies because they do want to see a return. But I would say both the marketing profession but also our own industries, I would say, are actually making it harder than what it needs to be to actually justify that spend. And there are some things that the data is actually pointing us towards that if we actually did it better, we would be able to see those results far more successfully and probably justify higher fees and better results as a consequence of the quality of that work. And I think the data is pretty clear about a couple of things. And I think for branding to do its bit in delivering business results, there is a correlation. I think fundamentally the role of branding is to build mental availability. That's to be able to build a space in people's heads so they make better decisions that basically favour your brand versus others. And there are some building blocks around those that the data has also highlighted. And there are three key ones. There are other things that we can talk about, but for today, I'll focus on those three. Is that to build that mental availability, emotional priming is fundamental. Because emotional priming is the thing that actually helps influence people in terms of memory, recall, making decisions. Works in the same part of the brain as those things. Distinctiveness helps with fluency, the ability to be able to pick out one brand versus another, to interpret it, to read it, to remember it easily and recognise it in the future. And then lastly, consistency over time, the execution of branding consistently over long periods of time demonstrate greater business results. However, what we see, and the data shows this out, is that the majority of brands are still built around the wrong things. They're largely built around a kind of rational or functional focus. There's a very high degree in most categories of conformity as opposed to distinctiveness, in complete contradiction of the data. And very high, and you hear Mark Ritson talking about this all the time, short-termism. The new thing sort of surpasses the old thing. It distracts us. The idea of creative burnout, the consumers get bored of things. Well, the data doesn't show that. In fact, the data shows that the more and more that you execute consistently off good creative, the better results that you get. And then I've added something else in here in terms of short-termism, which I call long-termism, which is kind of the wrong type of long-termism, where we actually hold on to the things that aren't actually doing the things the brand's supposed to do. And so those are the things that I want to be able to talk about in a little bit of detail today. And I'm going to go through each of these three and talk about them and show a little bit of data, and hopefully that's not too boring to some people. And Mikey, I will talk about consistency, and I know you didn't like consistency, but I hope you like what I have to say a little later. But for the purpose of emotional priming, you can see here rational versus emotional, and there's another piece of data I'll show that actually shows this out more effectively as well. Why wouldn't you choose kind of lean into emotional branding if it's actually delivering higher degrees of sales, market share, ability, loyalty? And this was a study that was done about 10 years ago. It's called The Long and the Short of It. Many of you may have read it. I try to reread it every year because actually there's really great stuff always in there, and it's actually a timeless study that has been built upon. And to me, this is one of the frameworks that are the really interesting frameworks in terms of how brands behave and how they deliver proper business results. And as a consequence of that, it's like, okay, well, this is pretty obvious. However, at exactly the same time, roughly over more than a 10-year period, the use of emotion in branding has been in decline. So we're actually contradicting the data as opposed to following it. And if organisations actually believe that they're truly data-driven and truly focused on ROI and other commercial results, well, why is this happening? Because it shouldn't. We should be going the opposite. And particularly, people often say for B2B brands, well, you've got it's a different sell, so emotion doesn't have as much a role. Well, it still has a role because at the end of the day, you're selling to people, and that's how you reach them, and that's how their brains function. And so, whether you're B2B, B2C, it doesn't make any difference. It's fundamental to how you build a brand. Distinctiveness. Okay. In this study, which was done by System 1 recently, and I've referenced all of these, so you can go and find them online as well, because they're actually the detail of these. There's lots of really great stuff in them. This one, fluency plus emotion. You can see actually non-emotional stuff in here. So kind of rational or non-emotional, sort of flatlining brands. Get you next to no performance uplift in terms of incremental profit in your business. That's what they found. Emotional, high uplift. Particularly, you can see that's over a 3-year time period. So again, or over 3 years, you're getting an accretive effect in terms of the consistent execution of emotional branding. And so you're actually getting better commercial results. You put fluency on top of that, so that's the distinctiveness part, which is largely part of what's wrapped up in fluency. You actually get a significant uplift again. So again, distinctiveness, really fundamental to building brands. However, a recent study in 2023 by Ipsos and JKR, 4.7 trillion spent on marketing, 85% of our branded assets fail in distinctiveness test. That's nuts. Okay, here's a bit of a breakdown. So you can see most of the assets that are created, in our whole industry every year of all the branding projects, waste of time. Only 15% are distinctive. You can break that down further. The things that we think are kind of important. I can kind of understand things like slogans and colours. The data does show out it's harder for people to actually connect distinctiveness with those things, but things like logos and mascots, you should be over-indexing on that stuff. That stuff should be sticky in people's heads. Unfortunately, we're dropping the ball left, right and centre with this stuff. And so, again, I can understand why a CEO goes, well, why should I spend this amount of money on this branding if this is all we're going to get? And when you look at categories, this is the payments category. Fintech more broadly, similar, kind of looks same. Sea of blue. PayPal set the codes, everybody largely follows them. So effectively what these companies that are doing when they undertake branding projects is they're providing category support as opposed to brand building. Now, it's not to say that some of them aren't successful, because there are a lot of successful organisations, and I use that word, not brands. And you can have a successful business without a successful brand. You can have a successful brand without successful branding. But if you choose to invest in branding, why don't we do it properly? Why are we throwing all this money away on stuff that's actually proven to be ineffective? Similarly in crypto. Now, my business that I run in here, I'm actually really busy doing this, unwinding this stuff. Crypto has largely sort of emerged in recent years, and effectively every brief that we see is like, oh, we've actually got to change because everybody in our category looks blue and black and purple, and we have very technical language in this space. So Web3 is an incredibly important part of our development above and beyond the crypto aspect. However, all it is a category that's emerged that's providing support to the category as opposed to building successful brands. And so a lot of our work is in actually unwinding this stuff. And then kind of the brain bubble that happened in the luxury industry a few years ago where they thought, oh, the world's going digital, so sans serif fonts were the answer to our problems. It's kind of a strange collective insanity when this happens, particularly for grown-up brands that have actually had distinctive assets and they let go of them. It's kind of weird. And there's a strange mental dynamic here that's going on that we need to make better decisions about this stuff that actually matter. And if we truly believe that we're focusing on actually being business focused, we've got to stop doing this kind of stuff. And to me, when you think of things like building emotion into brands, building distinctiveness, I kind of get excited about that because that's the kind of the cool bit. That's where you can be really creative. What's not to like about that? But why are we not doing enough of that? Because, I always like to get out of bed and think I'm going to make an emotionally engaging, distinctive brand that can be creative. And it actually delivers a result. And that's what the data's showing. Why are we hiding from this? And the last one, consistency. I think you will like this bit. Now, over the last 2 years, we've had kind of a lot of fun with few brands that have basically set themselves alight publicly. a couple of them. There's been a lot of weighing in, a lot of debate about the whys and wherefores of these. The owners of Jaguar and Range Rover gave us a 2-for-1 with those two. HBO doesn't know what they want to be, unfortunately. Good brands being ruined by their owners, and Cracker Barrel, who knows what they were thinking. But I'd say, these are perfect examples of why consistency matters. And I will talk about that in a little bit more nuance shortly. But I think, when you start to, again, read the data, consistency versus brands that aren't consistent, again, another System 1 study, you can see the business performance across all of those business metrics for sales, profit gain, market share, the ability to be able to move into new markets quickly, acquire customers, etc. It's like, why are we fighting against this stuff? It's already there. It's kind of cool. We can get better results if we build better branding that's consistently executed. But, and this is the bit I find really interesting around consistency, I actually find that often, and this is where I come back to my point about long-termism and the wrong sort of long-termism, is that I also see brands that are built for the long term where people hold on to things that aren't distinctive, aren't emotionally engaging. They hold on to aspects of their brands that are underperforming. And so consistency is good, but it's what sort of consistency is incredibly important. And I think there are a lot of timid people who don't make the right decisions. And I think often people hold on to research as being the answer. It is an aspect of decision making, but at the end of the day, somebody has to stand and deliver. And sometimes that requires hard decisions. And actually, sometimes it even means saying, actually, our research isn't actually telling the whole story. But often that gets missed. And so I have this hypothesis, having sort of, I work for an organisation that does about 300 branding projects a year around the world. And so you get to see a lot of this behavioural stuff, which is really interesting for me, is like how people make good decisions and bad decisions. So, I have this hypothesis. I love sort of research to be able to test this, because this is a kind of an interesting one, is that we don't notice the brands that are quietly dying into incremental neglect and mismanagement. And I reckon the majority of brands die that way. When I do brand architecture work, that's what I usually kill, is all of those brands. Like, I've probably killed more brands in my career than actually built. Because you can easily take a broadsword to all that stuff, because most of it is just like dying, sad brands, and you just want to put them out of their misery. The high-profile ones, actually, there aren't that many of them. But there's a group of people, and you can see them on LinkedIn, is that they're all going, see, when Jaguar does this kind of thing, or Cracker Barrel, they don't know what they're doing. No, you should never change your branding if this is going to happen. It's a mistake. You shouldn't change branding. There's a group of people out there that love to say that. I completely disagree with that, because if you stick with what you've got and it's no good in the first place, well, there's no point sticking with it. And so I would say, on the whole, there are very few brands that actually do what a Cracker Barrel does. But when you see them, everybody sees it. And I think that's the interesting thing about branding. I think branding is kind of your decision-making process made visible. And all your mistakes or all your good choices are actually up there for the world to see. And so you have to know how to make good choices, and it is very challenging. It requires a combination of sort of business intelligence and good taste, and actually sort of a bit of hard-headedness along the way. So how do we actually think about this? Well, I think, as I said at the very start, there's no point being consistent with the wrong assets. And so we need to have the assets that are distinctive enough and can drive emotion sufficiently. If we don't have those, it's a pretty good trigger for, actually we need to have a relook at our brand. And so how much consistency and when? And I know we will run a roundtable around this conversation a little bit later as well, but it is around how much do you change? Because you know what, sometimes maybe Cracker Barrel would have been right in different circumstances. We don't know. But making choices and sticking with them and actually making smart choices is really key. So I've got two cases. This one is one where we basically don't necessarily do a lot visibly, but it has a big impact. And Amazon's obviously a reasonably big company. Has a few assets that are valuable. And so really for our role with Amazon over the last 18 months or so has been to really take those assets and to make the most of them, not to change the world for them, because for the last 20 years, they haven't actually changed a lot. And this is the first time in those 20 years that they've re-looked at their branding. And so over those 20 years, their branding kind of got a little out of control. Their portfolio expanded significantly. I kind of learned a few things, like they own sort of pharmaceutical businesses and motor vehicle sales businesses and all sorts of things that you don't normally hear of in Australia, as well as kind of, their branding kind of just expanded and bloated, and dilution became a problem. And so we were asked to try and kind of fix them. Some of these things aren't flowing through, so I apologise for that. But I think some of the... Yeah, no, I'm not going to get the motion working, sorry. But, some of these elements just really needed tidying up. They really, it was from the Amazon logo itself, which is deciding not to show today, basically correcting that so it was actually had higher impact, particularly in digital environments where it was underperforming. The use of the colour palette, particularly that orange, which is kind of dominant for the brand, taking that typeface that is actually part of the Kindle typeface and extending that across multiple languages, across all media for them, actually building that into something that is high impact and ownable for them. So essentially this was a job about how do we take the distinctiveness that they have and how do we dial that up to 11. How do you wrangle the portfolio and actually make this system, because it is a process of systems thinking around how the brand works, how do you wrangle that into a portfolio so there is control, you can set rules, everybody can actually move in lockstep now so that you're actually, every decision that's made is reinforcing that investment that they've made successfully, and then across kind of all of the elements of the business. And so, and again, this is not going to show, I think our Wi-Fi is probably not working. And so as a result, with Amazon, billions of touch points, as I mentioned earlier, lots of subsidiaries across 15 markets, immediately huge uplift in terms of their metrics. And so that idea of fluency by improving their distinctive assets was achieved. And also on top of that, because of that kind of wrangling process of getting this into a system, significant savings in terms of the implementation and execution of the brand. So effectively it's paying for itself over and above sort of any commercial uplift in the brand. Airbnb, which is a project done 10 years ago or so, quite a different case study, because this is where transformational change mattered. And you can argue cases for and against whether Airbnb should have done this. Airbnb pre and then post the redevelopment of their identity system. Now you can say, look, Airbnb, they had a kind of interesting logo. That script face, they've had it for a while. That's a distinctive asset. Why wouldn't you keep that? But there are a couple of other things that are kind of more important. And they decided that they wanted different distinctive assets and they wanted to consciously build those. But I think the more important piece in the decision for the shift is deeper and more important than that. And I would say, when you look at the old Airbnb, I would say most of their competitors still look like that. Largely a logo with a transactional website. And so it's effectively what they're playing is a very rational game, their competitors. It's like, you want a room, you can get it, great. That's not what Airbnb wanted to play at. They had a bigger vision. And so their insight was this idea that most hotels are kind of the antithesis of travel. They're the opposite of being local. They put you in a sanitised room that all looks the same. And they said, well, if you're actually in somebody's home, you engage with the community, you engage with locals. Their brand wanted to own that space emotionally. And so that's where the idea of belong anywhere came from, to be able to build out their brand. And this idea of making people feel that was fundamental to the brand, above and beyond, you want a place to go and rent, great. That's not what the Airbnb story is fundamentally about. And so they went about we went about rebuilding the brand from the ground up. Yes, the typography which is partly responsible for the luxury brands doing this as well, because they wanted to copy Airbnb at the time. Very, very simple typeface, but the bellow itself, the symbol itself was the distinctive asset. The colour palette, the style of photography, the storytelling, all of those things were meant to be the distinctive assets for this brand. So a significant choice was made to step away from what could have been seen as a safe decision to make a radically different decision for their brand. Now, when this went to market, I think we might all remember this. What happened? This was the internet blew up, the whole bunch of gross examples of stuff that happened, which is pretty full on. Now the brand owners, the CEO and the other founders, now two of them, I think just two of them were designers. They were thinking about, should we actually do a Cracker Barrel and reverse this? This is bad. People hate this stuff. But in the end, they said, no, we've made a decision. We think it's strategically sound. we are very confident as designers ourselves that this is the right choice, that we want the market to actually understand what we really want to do here, and we want to build that over time. So I bet you're relieved I've moved off that slide. So to go back to that point about the hotels, this is Airbnb now, 8 million rooms for sale. Look at the other hotels, they're like a fraction of the scale. Not to mention none of the competitors that are direct competitors of Airbnb are anywhere near close to them. So early on, 10 years ago, they made that strategic decision to have a very significant shift, to not play the consistency game because they didn't believe consistency with their old branding was going to get them to where they were. They made a choice. The market hammered them for it and they said, no, we know better than you guys. Because we're leaders, we're building a new category, we have a design background and we know what good taste looks like, because taste is fundamental to making good decisions around this stuff. We will demonstrate to you why we have done this, and they've successfully done that. Now, to the point where they've given up largely their acquisition marketing work, largely they invest in brand, far more efficient. They've actually been cutting budgets, not because they're in financial problems, but actually because they're more efficient. And so it's an organisation that chose branding to signal something quite specific and powerful, and they're getting the returns for it. So this is a good example of an instance where consistency would have been a mistake, but now 10 years on, they've stuck with this brand. And they'll probably, for many, many years to come, refining it, but largely sticking with what they've had. And so, to conclude, I strongly believe all organisations get the branding they deserve. Cracker Barrel, Jaguar, as well as Airbnb and Amazon. And it's the consequence of those choices that we all see, whether it's the owners of those brands or the advisors. And we can make some choices. Data often gets a big rap for blanding brands, but I actually think in this instance, the data's really exciting because it's actually telling us to do better in areas that we should be doing better in. We're ignoring it. We're being way too tentative. So I kind of feel like, I might be a bit harsh here, but I kind of feel like we have a clear choice. We can choose to take branding seriously as a contributor to business and say what the data's telling us and get those results, actually prove that out further. Prioritise distinctiveness, emotional impact, and consistency, the right sort of consistency. Or we can choose to ignore the data, ignore and basically say, no, we don't give a damn about business performance. But to me, I read that as professional and commercial negligence. So it's a pretty good choice. I kind of get excited by it. Hope you do too. Thank you.